Hi, welcome to the bathtub. In the preternaturally silent office of the bathtub today. The Dodo's out of the room. Lucky's downstairs. It's an uneasy calm has settled over my life. I don't know what it is. It's almost like I can hear myself think, and I think I'm not thinking anything. I can hear myself think, and there's nothing going on up there. It's the interesting thing about when it gets very quiet. Anyway, it's very relaxing, so I can tell you that. Today, we're doing the second of two really quick ones. We're talking about this is called Weird Bathtub. We do weird tales. Everybody knew about weird tales before me. I never really read any. I never read any horror fiction, and I never read any of the weird tale H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and so forth until I came to California, and I did a piece about Clark Ashton Smith. I've told this a million times, but I loved him. I really loved him, and I really loved his correspondence with Lovecraft. And I read Lovecraft. I've enjoyed his work a lot, and I started reading these other books, particularly stuff that was made available to me by the great S.T. Joshi. We're all big fans of S.T. Joshi's work and the great people at Hippocampus Press. That's Derek Hussey, and I think there's somebody else out there whose name I forgot. See, I got notes falling out of all these books. This is their wonderful new, it's the second volume of they're going to do the complete works of another writer I'd never read until I started picking up Joshi's various anthologies. Algernon Blackwood. Always seemed like somebody I would never want to read. I don't know, like British horror writer. See pictures of him. He kind of looks like a character who would write horror fiction. Supposed to be a very lovely man. Arthur Macken, that's another person I've become a big fan of because of these associations. Anyway, I've been reading my way some in and out of these two amazing, beautifully done volumes by Hippocampus. Big fans of Hippocampus, and they're doing the complete stories. Is it the complete short stories of Algernon Blackwood? Collected short fiction. Okay, I'm sure he's had ups and downs. I never collected fictions. Collected fictions sometimes can be a little daunting because there's so many of the middle not so good stories mixed in, but so far the first two volumes, what I've read, I've really enjoyed, and I've been rereading a lot of him, and I've been rereading him, and this excellent, really, if you want to know Algernon Blackwood, get to know him. I read through this once and I'm reading through it again, which is Joshi's great introduction to it and a good selection of Blackwood stories over his life, and he's just a wonderfully interesting writer. I don't know how to describe him. He doesn't write this. There's no monsters in it. It's not like Lovecraft. We have some really peculiar, imaginative things happening to these people, like Color Out of Space and so forth. These really horrific things that happen to people. In Blackwood's work, it's almost like it's just like sensation of evil or sensation of otherness that comes throughout the stories. The whole stories are kind of these explorations of spaces where other things seem to be coming up out of the reality. They're kind of, he was a theosophist. He was a believer in sort of these theosophical idea that this is just an illusion and there's other realities beneath this illusion. I sure hope so. I sure hope this illusions. I've had enough of this illusion, especially if I have to watch 4 more months of Trump versus Biden. I could see anything beyond that would be exciting. And sometimes what's beyond it is not necessarily good, but whatever it is, it's unsettling. It's something we don't understand. Okay, he also reminds me a little bit of Henry James because his stories aren't really a lot of action, not a lot of dialogue, but there's just this like the Willows. You're just kind of moving through these landscapes, and you're getting the impressions of the narrators and the characters and what they're feeling as they walk through these landscapes, which are familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So that's my best way of describing him. I think he's a wonderfully interesting writer. I get a kick out of him. I find him very relaxing. He's a very relaxing writer. They're very kind of slow, and they're almost entirely atmosphere. So anyway, the past week or two, I read what was his most successful book was called The John Silence Stories. I think, don't get me, I'm probably wrong here, there's only 5 of them. One of his most famous ones was Ancient Sorceries, which shows up in a lot of anthologies, which is about a man who's traveling. I hope I'm not getting the stories confused. He's traveling and he gets off the train into this place, a city or a town, where everybody's sort of familiar and everyone seems to know him, but he doesn't recognize anybody. And what it is, it's this sense that he's actually visiting a place of former lives and former existences that he's been in before. Something like that. Anyway, John Silence stories are only 5 of them. They're actually big, very successful, and they helped Blackwood become a professional writer and stop doing his day jobs, which at the time was he worked in a powdered milk warehouse. He helped make powdered milk, of all things. And the idea is a kind of Sherlock Holmes sort of story. There's only a couple where Dr. Silence, who's a man who likes to help people, and he helps people with these kind of extra sensory experiences. The best example of one of the stories is a psychical invasion, which I liked a lot, which is about him going into. He meets a man who feels something's gotten into his house, a ghost of some sort, but Silence describes ghosts as different from just hauntings of individual persons. And he feels it changing his life and making everything disturbed, and everyone in the house is unhappy. And it describes his experiences. And I think that's the one where basically John Silence goes and spends the night in that house with a dog and a cat who are sort of attuned to these frequencies of extrasensory experience. Anyway, it's a really nice story. All 5 of the stories are just absorbed. I really just enjoyed reading them over several days. At least 2 or 3 of them, John Silence does almost nothing. There's one you don't even see him in it, really. He kind of shows up at the end, and then he signs a letter, and you know he's actually been helping out. They're very interesting plays off a series of stories. The closest comparison would be like a Sherlock Holmes. He's like a spiritual Sherlock Holmes, and he's got a buddy whose name I forget, who shows up in a couple of the stories, who sort of sometimes relates the stories. But they're basically just an excuse to have this one character go in and kind of understand these weird scenes. Okay, I'm going to read 2 quick passages. This is one of John Silence's explanations about what this ghost is, this haunting in this man's house. He says, "I think, as I told you before, that the forces of a powerful personality may still persist after death in the line of their original momentum," replied the doctor, "and that strong thoughts and purposes can still react upon suitably prepared brains long after their originators have passed away." So the thoughts have a force that kind of persists in the world. It's not the ghost of the person, it's their thoughts that have gone on. "If you knew anything of magic," he pursued, "you would know that thought is dynamic, and that it may call into existence forms and pictures that may well exist for hundreds of years. For, not far removed from the region of our human life, is another region where floats the waste and drift of all the centuries, the limbo of the shells of the dead, a densely populated region crammed with horror and abomination of all descriptions, and sometimes galvanized into active life again by the will of a trained manipulator. A mind versed in the practices of lower magic. That this woman understood its vile commerce, I am persuaded, and the forces she set going during her life have simply been accumulating ever since, and would have continued to do so, had they not been drawn down upon yourself, and afterwards discharged and satisfied through me." So this is after he's actually solved the problem of this woman's thoughts that have invested this man's house. I'll read one last little passage. Anyway, if you're interested in weird tales, you haven't read Blackwood, he's really a kick. And I wanted to read one of the appendixes to this volume is the author's note to a late edition, the 1942 edition of John Silence, Physician Extraordinary. And just the first paragraph is kind of interesting. "The reissue of these stories," Algernon Blackwood writes, "has a peculiar interest for their author. They first appeared some 35 years ago, and I vividly recall, about 1908, watching the horse buses lumbering along Piccadilly with the big red letters John Silence challenging attention on the knife board advertisement space. This was the original idea of the astute and enterprising Eveline Nash, but for me personally they stood for liberty. Why? Because the reception of the book suggested a possibility that I might make a modest livelihood by writing. In other words, live where I liked and be independent of a boss. The dream of every writer. At the time, I was in the dried milk business, an intimate, working associate of the man who owned the original dried milk patents, Glaxo, and other brands." So it was an interesting little picture of him at this time. And John Simons was the publisher was really behind it, really pushed this book, and he was actually putting on the sides of horse-drawn buses in the turn of the century. All right. Anyway, big fans of Algernon Blackwood. Oh, one last thing. Along the way, I was reading about this. This is called the Starlight Express. It is not the horrible, horrible, horrible stuff of that. What was his name? Who did the Phantom of the Opera? Anyway, Andrew Lloyd Webber. That's horrible music and awfulness. But this is Sir Edward Elgar and Blackwood teamed up. Believe this or not, they teamed up to adapt one of Blackwood's many books. He wrote lots of books besides the kind of weird horror stuff. And one was kind of called A Prisoner in Fairyland, which was a sort of Peter Pan. Kids go off into the celestial theosophical wilderness and enjoy the life without their parents. And it's kind of a magical kids book, which I have not read. And it was adapted for stage. And they brought Edward Elgar in, and he wrote this incredible music for it. And it is sort of, it's largely a narrative story. So there's a narrator, and then there's this beautiful music. And I picked this up online. It's who's doing the it's Simon Callow, the great Simon Callow, who's passed away, who's dead by now. But he was a wonderful actor. He does all the readings from it. And then I have to say, I haven't paid too much close attention to the readings. It kind of come in and out. The music is lovely. It's really very kind of fable-ish fantasy, fairy tale music, but with some extraordinary lifts and some beauty in it. So anyway, this is if you're interested in either Elgar or I can never remember Algernon. I keep wanting to call him Algernon Wall or Oberon Wall. I think I keep wanting to say Algernon Blackwood. Then this is worth getting. I'm really enjoying this. I'm listening to it a bit. Okay, stay safe. Get weird. Get weird in the bathtub. Bye.